My guest at this time is Alireza Jafarzadeh. He is the Deputy Director in the Washington office of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. He is joining us today as, once again, massive protests are erupting inside the nation of Iran by most reports in at least 100 cities, most of it related to a massive 50% increase in the price of gasoline. That has folks leaving their vehicles on the side of the road. The Iranian government is accusing the MEK, the organization with which Alireza is affiliated, of essentially instigating this. And so we'll get into all of this as the time permits here. So, Alireza, is this entirely related to the 50% gas hike? And what's the reason for the gas hike?
Well, certainly it was triggered by the gas hike, price that was 50% for a certain amount of usage, and 300% for, if you wanted to use a little bit more. And that was just like the last straw that broke the camel's back, because the people have been under pressure for a long, long time. And people felt this is the opportunity to get their voice out and let the Ayatollahs know that they cannot continue suppressing the population. They cannot continue plundering the wealth of a nation at the cost of the people, especially the poor people, as the mullahs are getting richer and richer every day. And that's how it started, on Friday, just 4 days ago. And it was heightened on Saturday, and then it's continued until today, which is Monday. And so far, we've had over 110 cities engulfed in these protests that, even though it started with the issue of the gas price, but it's targeting the entirety of the regime. People are chanting death to Khamenei, death to Rouhani, death to dictatorship, death to the Velayat Faqih system, which is the political system, religious system that is ruling Iran. And they're targeting the state security forces directly. They're not afraid of the guns, the brute force that the repressive forces are bringing against the population. They have nothing else to lose, especially the younger generation. They are in the street and they're not deterred by them firing, directly shooting at the demonstrators using live ammunition. They're not afraid of tear gas. They're not afraid of any kind of intimidations or threats by the regime's officials. To the contrary, they're saying, we're going to get things in our own hands. The money that is stolen from the people is given to the Revolutionary Guards, who are thriving every day, who are, sending the money to even fund the Revolutionary Guards proxies in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and other places. And people don't take it anymore. That's why they attack the government buildings. They attack the banks. By the way, the banks in Iran are all controlled and owned by either the Revolutionary Guards or those associated with the Supreme Leader. And they attack the vehicles of the security forces. And so far, as a result of the regime firing on the demonstrators, over 200 people have been killed. Over 1,000 people have been arrested based on official figures, which we believe the actual numbers are higher. And so many others have been injured. And nevertheless, that hasn't really shut down the population. People feel they have a lot more momentum to go, and they feel this is the time for them to let the Ayatollahs know what they feel, how strongly they feel against the Ayatollahs in its entirety. It's not about Rouhani, it's not about Khamenei, it's about the whole thing.
I've also seen that Iran cut off internet access. So what do the Iranian people know about what support they have? And before all this started on Friday, were they aware of the freedom protests in places like Hong Kong, for example, that might give them inspiration to take this longer than just a few days?
Well, it's a good question you raised, Greg. Definitely the internet was cut off about 48 hours ago were for two purposes. Number one, to disrupt the communications among the demonstrators, because it's a very well-organized protest going on in each city, in each area, but also connecting all the dots around the country, and with a focused message, against the entirety of the regime. Second, the regime doesn't want the video clips and the messages to get outside of the country because they're afraid of the international backlash. Despite all the limitations the regime has imposed and the internet has been cut off for the past 48 hours, yet the world has seen, a huge amount of, video clips that shows the level of the brutality of the regime, but on the other side, the desire of the nation to free themselves. And in terms of timing, that you mentioned Hong Kong, and what is even more relevant to the people in Iran than Hong Kong is what was happening next door in Iraq, that the population in Iraq, especially the Shia population, which the regime had invested heavily, they have risen against the Ayatollahs, and the protests have been going on since early October in Iraq from, Najaf and Karbala. These are the two holiest Shia cities in the world that were rebelling against the Iranian regime's influence in that country to Baghdad and other places. And then you had in Lebanon, people were protesting largely against the influence of Hezbollah, a proxy of Iran, of the Iranian regime. So this is like people feel that they are being empowered by similar voices in other countries, other nations, against the Iranian regime. And that's why I think at this time, really the role of the international community is very important, what kind of message they're sending to the regime and also to the people of Iran. It took a while before the outside world acted, but eventually the U.S. government has condemned the attacks by the Iranian regime against the protesters, has condemned the shutting down of the internet, has said that the people have the right to protest and the regime must respect it. The same situation came from many members of Congress, both in the Senate and the House, on both sides of the aisle, which is very encouraging. Some European nations who were very slow in the beginning, finally today, Germany and France made some statements to this effect. But the UN, United Nations, has a key role. They need to really treat this as a crime against humanity. When you have, this many number of protesters being killed, they need to get involved. The Security Council of the UN need to meet and hold the Iran regime accountable. This is the same regime that needs to be investigated for a number of other crimes that they have done before. In summer of 1988, as many as 30,000 political prisoners were murdered by the Iran regime for their political beliefs. And the same people who ordered those killings or executed those killings are now in charge. In fact, the judiciary chief is also, one of them. So that's why I think a lot can be done and needs to be done on the part of the international community. Members of Congress can play a big role. The U.S. government can do a lot more. They have the ability to open the internet and provide access to the protesters, to the people of Iran. And so far, unfortunately, that hasn't happened. And we're hoping that in the coming days, more efforts will be pushed in that direction. Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, the president-elect of the NCRI, who's been, following the whole developments and situation there. And she actually put out several statements urging the Security Council, urging the United Nations, urging all of the nations in the West to stand up and defend the people of Iran. And you mentioned the MEK, the resistance units in Iran, and these are like young people in different cities who have paid a very high price over the past 2-3 years in paving the way for change in Iran. And the people have responded very well to that. And Khamenei, the supreme leader, as you correctly said in the beginning, put the blame of the protests on the MEK. But one thing he cannot avoid is that, this is a nationwide protests by the people from all walks of life who are protesting against the entirety of this regime. Of course, MEK has taken the lead, but it's a popular effort by the people who want change, and nothing can silence the voice of a nation who is determined to bring about change. And of course, we're all very proud and playing our role in paving the way, in leading the way, and being their voice and being out there day in and day out.
Last question. We just have about a minute or so left here, Ali Reza. You and I have had this discussion on some level before about massive protests engulfing many different cities in Iran, and we've speculated as to whether this could be the tipping point where the current regime either has to make massive changes or they have to go. Ultimately, to this point, it has not happened. What would have to happen to make this different for either major changes or for a regime change entirely?
Well, what's different now in compared to 2 years ago or back in 2009 is the intensity of these protests. We've never had this level of anger on the part of population in large scale targeting the regime's specific centers. They're not targeting any civilian buildings or anything. It's just entirely focused on the IRGC and the regime. So this is a new element that is really frightening the Iranian regime. The second element is the role of the organized resistance that is a lot more capable and empowered by creating those resistance units in Iran. Now, what can really tilt the balance in favor of the population is the international community, the role they play. They need to really come out and stand on the side of the people of Iran, not just by putting out statements, which is very good, very important, but also taking specific measures to hold the regime accountable for what they're doing in killing the people, in helping the protesters by providing free access to the internet, and be there out there every single day to side with the protesters. There's no need to intervene directly. The people have all the capability and everything they need. They only need the outside world to prevent the Iranian regime to get away with the murder, and to outside world to side with them in facilitating their communications among themselves and getting their messages out. Remember in Solidarity movement in Poland, when the world stood up on the side of the people, how powerful that was and how that changed the dimension of all of that. The same situation in South Africa, when the world stood on the side of the people and against the apartheid. And this is what we need to see now on the part of the international community regarding Iran.
Okay, this is really going to be the last question, because you talked about the vital role of the international community that it has to play here. From the perspective of the Iranian resistance and from the perspective of the United States, Iran is seen as a huge problem. World's largest sponsor of terrorism. Obviously, what it's inflicting on its own people is horrible. But from an international community perspective, it doesn't seem like Iran is seen as that much of a problem. It seems like they side with Iran more than the United States in the differences over the nuclear deal. It seems like there's much more respect and deference to Iran at the UN, for example, than there ever would be in the United States.
Well, that's sad to see, unfortunately, Greg. But I think the realities on the ground can easily change all of that. When the Europeans and other nations who are pinning hope on this or that faction of the regime realize that this regime has no future, no matter how they look at the nuclear issue or the missile issue or other things, then they will be ready to change their attitude and their policy. What is important is the role the U.S. has played and can play in the future as well. The maximum pressure policy has been effective. It has really hurt the Iranian regime. It has limited the ability of the Revolutionary Guards and others, and that's what needs to be continued, coupled with the approach the U.S. should take in reaching out to the Iran resistance, to the people on the ground, to those who are desiring freedom. And when the U.S. takes the lead in a very strong way, you will see that its impact on the Europeans and others, because the situation on the ground is very, very favorable and very promising.
We'll certainly be watching, and I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. Ali Reza, we always appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be on the show, Greg.
Absolutely. Great to have you. Ali Reza Jafarzadeh is the Deputy Director of the Washington office of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.